right, so welcome. So we're gonna go ahead and get started so that we can end on time. Hold on, y'all cannot see my screen. I'm not sure why. Resume share. 1 second. Okay, I believe you guys can see my screen now. So there's a couple of things that I want to kind of set up today's call around when we look at the disc. How are we, making sure that we're utilizing this in communication with our people? And it's going to start with, have we read the disc, right? So have we taken the disc assessment, and then have we read our own disc? So those are going to be the two big pieces. If for any reason you have not already, if you've taken the disc and we haven't emailed it back to you, if you'll make sure that you put that note in the chat box, we'll go ahead and do that. And then as we go through here, if you have questions about your own disc, let me know. Let's talk about that, especially when we look at these different pieces. I think that you're going to go, oh, that makes sense. That's why, the how I do things and the way that how that person does those, why we're kind of maybe butting heads or that type of thing. So diving in. Maybe diving in. I don't know. Okay, it's going to be very interesting. So one of the pieces that I always want to start back with when we look at DISC, use and discuss the DISC language only with those who know the language. It is such a, when we're learning something new, it's very easy for us to start talking about, I'm a this, I'm a that, you're a this. Make sure that we use this only with those who know the language. You exhibit your knowledge of the language by knowing your behavioral style and recognizing other people's, and then adapting that to greater communication. Because the whole point of the DISC is greater communication. And then rule 3, teach others the language in a setting where appropriate, for them to, and that's available for their understanding. So just always want to start there. And then reminder, this, it's a person's behavior is the sum of the intensity of all 4 factors. That way we're not labeling as any one of the 4. There's an energy line and where do we lead, but it's a sum of the intensity of all 4. And the DISC only looks at observable behavior. So people are much more complex than the DISC model shows, because we have values and motivations, and yet it is a great starting point for communication. So again, if for any reason you're on this and you haven't taken the DISC assessment, or we haven't emailed it to you, email me, we'll resend it to you so that you have your DISC and you're able to read that DISC. All right. So today we are going to, one of the biggest challenges to effective interaction is to recognize that people may have a behavioral style different than our own, right? A lot of interaction breaks down because of lack of awareness of the behavioral differences. All people don't communicate the same way, right? We tend to, and this is when we look at our clients, building businesses, teams, we tend to think that the way that we responded to it, or the way that that's the right way, keeping in mind that other people's response is not wrong or right. It's just being able to recognize that. So we're to do this effectively, we're gonna learn their behavioral style, or our own behavioral style. We're gonna recognize others' behavioral style, and then we're gonna adapt our behavior for greater communication, okay? Again, remember what we talked about last week. It's not about adapting or being fake. It is about recognizing the difference. So if you, very simple, but if you drink, Pepsi, I'm not a fan of Pepsi, but if you come to my house and I know you drink Pepsi, I'm going to put Pepsi in my refrigerator for you. It's not about being fake. It is about, I want to make you feel welcome. I want to make great. So that's where the DISC can really help. So one of the most important skills to acquire is the ability to interact effectively with clients and agents, right? Like that is our world. And of course, our family is going to be blessed with this as well. Most of us already adapt behavior to the environment. The DISC language provides the knowledge to be able to adapt more quickly to the person by observing behavioral cues. So how do these different styles blend? That's going to allow us a more thorough understanding of the DISC language and its powerful impact on interpersonal relationships and work interactions. Wow, sorry guys, I've got this all over the place. Okay, maybe that's better. And this is a great time if you have your DISC, pull it out. Because again, typically when we read the DISC, if we're not careful, we read it from the, oh, this is who I am. That is very beneficial, and that's where we want to start. And then we want to go, okay, how do I utilize this in communicating with other people? Well, if you're a high D, your D's over the energy line, and you're communicating with another high D, right? High Ds are competitive, direct, self-reliant. So two high Ds are going to understand each other's drive for action. Both need a challenge and both need to direct. So expect the discussion between the two to be lively. Both of them are unafraid of conflict. Heck, a lot of times Ds don't even know that there's conflict. They're just, right, taking charge. They're doing this. So if a vision and purpose is clearly painted, the high Ds can work together well to get it done. Both are highly risk takers and may need to slow down to look at the facts. Because of their tendency to be task-oriented, each will need to heighten their awareness of the other and cognitively take time to listen before taking action. So think about this. If you're in a listing agreement, you're a high D, they're a high D. There are times that it's okay to those are the times when we think about, you know, like a D and pushing back. So a great example of this would be, it was on a listing appointment with an expired. And we got to the point where we're talking about the commission and you know, what are you going to charge for commission? I said 6%. And the guy, he's an old farmer, right? He kind of pushed back and he goes, well, they were only going to charge me 3. I said, yeah, I'm going to sell it. And he laughed and it worked. If he would have been a S behavioral style, it's very possible I would have lost with him because he would have seen me as, oh, you're, you know, being ego driven, that type of thing. But he was a D, so I could push back and it worked for him. So depending on, right, where, because D is looking for results, efficiency. A D communicating with an I. The high I, they're looking for the experience. Now, the high D and high I, they both share the sense of urgency, risk-taking, and a desire to change their environment and the world, right? For better or worse, depending on their values. Both are extroverted. They differ, though, in the way they approach people. The high I will use verbal ability to win others to their argument, whereas the high D is going to be very direct and to the point. Working well together, the high D will be very direct and to the point. Working, now keeping in mind that when they are working well together, the high D is going to need to add a little fun to the task and slow down just a bit, knowing that the interaction and fun are motivating to the high I. So I want you to think, if you're a high D and you have run into this with working with somebody that's a high I before, and, you know, were you thinking about, hey, they're looking for the experience. Let me slow it down and interact some fun in here. The high D must allow the high I to verbalize and also must allow a bit more time for the decisions to be made. So again, if you're a high D communicating with a high I, are you letting that I talk? Because if you walk in there with an ID and you're like, okay, this is how, and this is the I may need to be able to process this. So take that into consideration. Now a high D communicating with a S. Remember, the high S is looking for security. So the high D is going to have a tendency to overpower the high S because of the high D sense of urgency and high risk. The high D will need to slow down significantly making sure that high S has the time to process the information given. The high S is a moderately low risk taker requiring time to think. Now, interesting enough, a high S desires harmony. So they may have a tendency to go along even though disagreeing with a high D. So if you're on this call and you're a high D, I want you to be thinking about this. Have you ever done that? Like whether it's because you left a listing appointment or you thought everybody was in agreement with you, and then later you found out nobody was, and you're like, why didn't anybody say? Well, because you overtalked them. And that's what sometimes happens. So high Ds typically, right, non-emotional by nature. It doesn't mean they don't have emotions, they just don't show them. That lack of emotional display must not be confused with agreement. Use my mom, for example. When my mom moved here, I made sure that the land I purchased beside me she could have chickens, because I knew that's very important to her. I was having her move from where she lived to beside me. So I made sure that she could have chickens. In my mind, because it is still kind of town, I was like, we're going to have like 10 chickens, right? Again, not paying attention to behavioral styles. I thought her lack of disagreement meant we were on the same page. I go out of town, I come back, and there's like way more than 10 chickens, right? And I say that story because it's kind of funny, because how often does this, because she never agreed to what I said, but I made an assumption because I didn't slow down and I didn't ask questions. And she's not one that's going to say, not like there. Now, don't be wrong. S's can absolutely say no, but it's usually when they're fighting for somebody else. So make sure that we don't take their lack of emotional display and be confused that means that they're in agreement. And then the high D must work hard to develop a trust relationship that allows the high S the comfort to verbalize concerns, right? So the high D has to work really hard at listening. So keep those pieces in mind. So I want you to think about a client that you have that you think is the opposite behavioral style of as you. What did you just learn that you need to do? Do you need to speed up, slow down, right? Listen more, making sure the high S. Because sometimes whenever I think of salespeople, sometimes when people think we can't trust a salesperson. It actually, what could be happening is they're a D or an I, so they're talking fast and they're moving fast. And that S behavioral style, they're moving too fast for them to process. So they feel like they're being forced into a decision, which comes off with them feeling that that's icky, right? And so then they're, salesman. No, just different behavioral styles and how they approach that. So keep that piece in mind. And then a high D communicating with a high C, right? Remember the high C, that's that compliant. High C is looking for information. Sometimes a D, when being questioned by a high C, or many times, especially when they don't know themselves or the behavioral style, they feel attacked. Because the C is going, what about this? What about that? Blah, blah, blah. And the D is like, I already know. And so they feel attacked, and that breaks communication. High D is going to be a fast mover. A C is a slow mover. So you also got high risk to low risk. A D has little need for data compared to a C having a great need for data. You've got a D that's a quick decision maker, a C that is a slow decision maker. An example of this, and you guys can think of these from your own lives, right? But like we were running the 50 miler and we left before daylight, and everybody's running. We'd already made multiple like missed turns, and like there's a whole group of people standing there, and we're looking at that and we're going, is that arrow pointing this way or that way? Somebody picked up the phone and they're going to get more information. That could have been a D being very direct. It could have been a C getting more information. Could have been an S saying, hey, we're gonna take care of everybody and find out what's right. Do you see how? And then there were the D's that said, you know what? One of them's right. Let's just go that way. The reason I bring that up is it's very important. We can have that that D can have the C in their life, because it is going to make sure that we're not just going a particular direction, because sometimes D's will do that. The benefit for a C is sometimes they need to, somebody needs to just say, hey, let's go that way, right? So they can definitely complement one another, and yet are you really being cognizant of the how in the behavior? So the high D is going to need to adapt extremely to increase the communication with the high C. The greatest challenge for that high D is to slow down and get the facts. So the high D needs to give more information than normal, but not take personally, but not talk personally with the high C or be too pushy, right? So both the high D and the high C, they share a need to use time wisely to control their environment. So interesting enough, a D and a C, task oriented, an I and a S is people oriented, right? So I'm going to kind of pause right here. What are your takeaways? What are you learning? What stood out from what we looked at with these pieces so far?
Hey, Olivia.
Hey.
I'm learning. I love the interaction with different, learning the interaction with different personality styles. That's big for me because, like you said, just learning how people tick, how people move. And I love that with our business, but also with my children, with life, with talking to people. So that's really what I'm learning right here and enjoying.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks. Anybody else?
I kind of piggyback on that. And it's always good to have this perspective and to remember that not everybody thinks the same, and that's okay. And it just gives you something to do and focus on so that you can make it work.
That's right. And keeping in mind, it's that, how do people respond to things, right? The intensity in which they respond, right? Something happens, a D is going to respond maybe, very intense. A C's thinking, well, what happened? What can we do next? So they're processing and getting enough information to make that next leap. Yeah. Now, so one of the things that we're going to kind of do, let's do this. So, Joe, what is your, what's the letter that you lead with?
I.
Okay. So let's look at I, and which style do you feel like you have the most challenge with connecting with?
I used to think it was D, but I really don't, because I can recognize, I think D's are pretty easy to recognize. So I can immediately jump into, the mode of understanding who I'm dealing with, not taking things personally, understand when they cut you off. And, that's how my team leader is. And I know a lot of people like that. The people that are, maybe the C's, because like you said earlier, I had this come up earlier this week. The example you gave about with a D and a C, where the C maybe, my lender, for example, is a high D, and a client that he had pre-approved was a C. And the client said to me, boy, I really didn't understand everything Joel was explaining. He kind of went fast. And then I called my lender, Joel, and I explained to him, and he flew off the handle. And he said, are you kidding me? I explained everything. And, why didn't he tell me he didn't know the answers? And, essentially that the guy's an idiot. I said, let's slow down a second. I said, maybe he was just afraid, to say that he didn't understand. And so I gave him that perspective. And now I'm like, it's all really starting to become more clear. And I think for me, it's the same thing. The C is a little bit more challenging if they're not willing to say to you, even if you do say to them, you understand this? Do you have any questions? Sometimes people are afraid because in this case, the guy was a very smart, successful person. He just didn't understand the financing. That's just not his game. And I think he didn't want to appear to be a fool in front of the lender. And the lender didn't understand that. But now that you're explaining this, I'm going to call him after after this call.
Yeah, well, and this is the cool part. So have your lender take the DISC assessment and read it, right? And share what we did last week too. But yeah, so this is the interesting thing. If we go back and we look at what is the fear of a C?
That we're not complying with some rule or regulation or expectation.
Yeah, that we're gonna be wrong. I'm pulling the C because this is super important, and I didn't bring the slide in today, but this is if we look at, so the emotion of a high C is fear. The higher the C factor, the more the individual will be low risk, following procedures and going by the book. And they are a perfectionist. So it's not like fear walking around like, oh, I'm scared of everybody, but more like I'm fearful of being wrong. So now you have a D behavioral style that is going fast and to the point. So they're both task oriented, and yet, you know, and it's very possible that your lender's probably like leads with a DI. Of course, I don't know him, but just it's possible. And so he's over talking, he's pushing, and then all of a sudden the D doesn't want to appear wrong, so he doesn't say anything. And the other interesting thing with the story, because this is something we can all learn from, whenever you told the Joel and he immediately responded with like pushback and kind of flew off the handle, what is the what's the emotion of a high D?
Keep pushing.
Anger, short fuse. Now again, so now the interesting thing is, because I know that sometimes, you know, D's will look at that and go, well, I'm not angry. Well, yeah, it's the emotions. You're not even really mad at somebody, but it's like when a D also, they're scared of being taken advantage of. So if you're scared of being taken, or if that's your, you know, that's your concern of being taken advantage of, and you think you did a good job, right? So you see how those all connect if we don't know ourselves and that other person. So thank you for sharing that, because that's a great example to be able to look at both sides of this. Now, and then when we look at the high I communicating with a C, so the high C, again, they're looking for information. So the high I will have few, if any, behavioral commonalities with the high C. This behavioral match is the toughest of all for the high I. Isn't that interesting that that's when you called out? Because it's extrovert to introvert. So the feeling style to a data-oriented style. High risk to low risk. Indirect style to direct style, and a high I, it's a trusting style to a C, which is an untrusting style. So the high C is a challenge for the high I. However, if both can capitalize on their behavioral strengths, this can be an incredible team. The high I will have to slow down, keep a tight rein on emotions, and provide the necessary data to the high C. Personal talk is typically not allowed, as the private life of the high C is exactly that, private. Now, I don't mean once you're friends and that type of thing, but they're just a little bit more private. I may share a lot more. The high I will need to reduce gestures and definitely not touch the high C. So it makes sense. And the interesting thing is this can be the worst or the best relationship for a high I, right? Because a high I that has a C in their world that, so now this is the extreme, right? Because a lot of what we're talking about, and sometimes it's easy to get to the extreme, but I want you to think the older people that are taken advantage of by somebody calling them and saying they need money, or they can put their money in and they get a lot of, give me 10,000 and I'll, give me $200 and I'll give you 10,000. So it could be because they're old. They could also be a high I. High I's trust people, right? And then you factor in maybe their older age or things like that. But so keep that in mind. Now, if that high I was married to or had a kid that was a C that said, hey, let me ask some questions here, they would have been safe. So it can be a beautiful relationship. But a high I is typically really trusting, and a C is going to ask a lot of questions. That's also the pushback with a D and a C, because an I is like, yeah, let's go tackle the world. And the C is like, well, how are we going to do that? Well, when are we going to do that? Well, and the I is like, why you don't think I can do it? Well, they didn't say that. They just want to. And so if you'll step out of that to go, no, they're actually asking great questions because I didn't know how I was going to do it. We were just going to go. That can be a very beautiful thing. So, but just keeping those, where do we need to move? All right. What about who else is on the call that's that leads with maybe an S or a C?
I have a mixture. I'm pretty high on both S and C, and the rest almost non-existent.
Okay. And we typically do lead with 2 or 3. Which one's higher for you, the S or the C?
The C is, but slightly on pretty much all 3 charts.
Okay. So which behavioral style do you find that you have the hardest challenge communicating with?
Oh, D's 100%. And not because they upset me, but because I don't understand why they get upset when I question.
Yeah. See how, right? Yeah. Because you're like, why are you mad? Why are you, right? Like, so this is the interesting thing. So high C communicating to high D. And if you'll notice in these slides, because you had that, okay, if I'm a high D, how do I communicate with a high C? If I'm a high C, some of it's the same, but it's looking at it from a different lens, right? So the high C, high D, they're both task oriented. The area of potential conflict lies in the arena of speed and risk orientation. The low risk of the high C versus the high risk of the high D. Slow decision making requires a great deal of data, as opposed to the fast decision making requiring little data. Both are alike in that they have high expectations of each other. This may cause the C to be too critical and the D to be too demanding. However, awareness of their behavioral differences can give birth to a fantastic team. It's when we're not aware of, right? Because, and you nailed it, right? Where you're going, why? I'm just asking questions. Why are you mad? Right? And in their mind, it's because you're not asking questions about the process. You don't think that they are, again, in their mind, this is not what the high C is, but in their mind, you're questioning them. You think they haven't thought it out, or and they probably haven't, right? But it's like they feel the questions as a personal attack versus you going. So how, knowing this, how could you phrase it or set it up so that you are able to ask the questions that you need, and the D not to have that, because their emotion, right, is anger, right? That first. So, and it's not, again, it's a funny thing. It's not even anger at you. It's a reaction, right? But it feels like it's at me. Knowing this, how would you set this up to create a different conversation the next time you're in that spot?
Are you asking me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my husband is, he has not taken this, but I having known him for 40 years.
We can identify from their behaviors, yeah.
And I preface my conversations with him, or anybody, because most real estate agents I've run across actually seem to be higher D than I am. I always say, I really don't understand. So when I ask a question, it's because I don't understand. And I think that kind of tones the conversation down. So they don't take it personally. And with most people, most Ds react to me. I don't take it personally, but with my husband, I do.
Yes.
So,
But yeah, that's it's definitely, you know, how are we wording that so that they can see it from a different view. Okay. All right. What about who leads with their S on the call? Anybody? Okay.
I am pretty close. S and C. Did somebody else answer?
No, and that's okay. And this is the interesting piece too. Is so some of us have, some of us, because we've really been focused on, you know, the extreme, right? If we only had one, but we typically all have two or more, and how those relate also makes a difference. And yet, so like I'm a DIC, a DCI, DIC, something like that. DIC, I'm a DIC. So the interesting thing is, because my C is above that energy line, I ask questions a lot. And I'm sharing this for you because especially with family or even in businesses. So I have brothers that are also in real estate. And it's very funny how often my mom, being a high SC, has thought she needed to like stand between us because she thought we were going to come to blows. We were just having a conversation. It's just loud, right? Because it's that we're not even mad at each other. It's just that emotion shows up a certain way. Now, the interesting thing, because of the me with the C, is me asking them. So like I've got a brother that he would charge hell with a bucket of water and convince that he's going to be successful. And I'm over here going, all right, I'm with you, but what kind of bucket? And where can we find more water? And let's make sure we're prepared, right? And before doing this, that was a huge, he just thought like that, you know, I didn't care for him, or I didn't think anything from, and more importantly, that I didn't think he could do it. And he's highly successful. And so being able to change the conversation to go in, heck yeah, let's do that. We're going to charge that heel. How can I support you in charging that heel? Now, right there, you're allowing them to, again, and they're going, well, you know, I'm not sure. Well, could I ask some questions? Because I think maybe I can help here. So it's just about being able to do that communication style. The cool part is now, you know, I'm the go-to person around, hey, this is where I want to go. How do I get there? But it's just identifying the language that we're using that, that again gets the results that we want to. Now, I will say all that and preface this with, none of this gives anybody, because we talk about the D's having their anger being that emotion. None of this gives anybody a reason or excuse to be, just for lack of a better word, just a butthole or whatever. So if whether you're a D and you have that anger come up, you still have to, let it go and have the conversation, learn these pieces about you. And then if somebody is yelling or screaming, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a D. They're just a butthole, and it is okay for you to go, hey, and we need to step back and breathe. You're not allowed to talk to me that way, and move forward. So I always want to make sure that we understand that one doesn't give the ability to do the other. Okay. So ultimately, we just want to know, with what we covered, people communicate differently. Behavioral style matching indicates how the styles initially blend, and interacting with people at all levels is an important skill to acquire. Understanding the behavioral needs of all styles and how to blend your style to each results for improved communication, because this is what this is about, is improved communication. I want to point out one other piece. Joe, you said this, and I meant to go back to this, but I just lost my train of thought about, maybe nope, lost it again. Never mind.
Lender?
Yeah, it was the lender, but it was something about, nope, I lost it. It's gone. It's okay. Now, we're going to come back if we have time, and we're going to talk about the value of the different behavioral styles. being some specifics on communicating with them as well, and how to motivate a D, right? And then even possible limitations to them. We're going to do that for all of those if we have time, but I want to take a moment, or I want to make sure that we cover this particular piece when we use this in hiring. So how do we utilize the DISC in hiring? What? One second, guys, I'm moving forward. Okay. How do we use this in hiring? And then how do we use this with clients? So the more you learn about this, the more you're going to be able to just see, like last week, we talked about different ways, like if we see somebody and being able to identify their behavioral style by the colors of clothes that they wear, by what they drive and that type of thing. But this is also something that you might decide to put in your listing packet and your buyer consultation when they fill out paperwork. And it just simply says, if your best friend were to describe you out of the following 4 choices, which one would they choose? Direct and to the point, natural born salesperson, warm, sincere, friendly, cautious, and perfectly accurate. When they circle that, or if they go, oh, well, I'm like this and this, that's going to help you identify with what they're leading with and help you structure your conversation to them. And you could have one for the, like if there's 2 people buying, spouses, partners, whatever, have them both fill that out. But we actually would put it on our survey for the, the listing agreement, and we would get them to fill that part out. And then what's your wider company, energy, all of those types of things. Nobody's ever had an issue. They usually laughed and they started talking amongst themselves. Oh, you're right. But again, it's how do I quickly, without having to give anybody an assessment, how do I start identifying what they lead with? Okay.
Olivia?
Yes.
Back when we were doing buyer consultations in the office, we would give a clipboard. When people would come in, I'd have either the assistant, when I had one, or whomever was working at the front desk would welcome them and give them this along with a few other questions. And so what I liked about it was, especially if it was a couple, that I would always ask, so why did you say direct and to the point, right? And then when you ask them that, they'll tell you, or their spouse or significant other, whoever it is, would usually give an example. So it really does work. And I'm glad you pointed out, because that's something that we need to get back to for these Zoom buyer consultations to send ahead of time. But also for listings. I never really thought of it like that before the listing appointment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very powerful if you're not utilizing that to use it, because then because that's the other thing. Like, say if you have somebody that's cautious and perfectly accurate, I'm going to have a different conversation with them around, like even what I'm putting in the MLS, because I'm going to say, look, you know the house better than anybody else. So when we get it all into the MLS, I'm going to send it to you. If you will just go through and make sure that we've got all the I's dotted, T's crossed, and all of the information is accurate. What are the 2 things that I'm doing right there by having that conversation?
I feel like you're trying to determine how to speak to them, and also giving them kind of warm fuzzies in that they're not in control, but yeah, they have some control over what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also setting it up so that I don't feel attacked when they find an error. Right? Like, and so that doesn't, and they don't feel like they don't have that, especially like maybe in the past, they've pointed out something to somebody that wasn't accurate and they got their head bit off. So again, it's just opening that communication where I'm allowing them to say, hey, this is an issue, and everybody's comfortable with it. That's what I was thinking about, Joe. Whenever you were, if I lose it again, I would be so upset. Oh, you said, sometimes a C won't pick up or speak up, even if you've asked the question. What question are you asking? Because if we're asking, and then how long are we slowing down? And that's for all of us that, anybody that leads with that eye, be aware of, because if it's rapid fire, they're still processing or is it, are you really true? Like, are you really gonna take what I say, or are you really listening to me, I guess, right? So, so just what are the questions? Are they open-ended? Have you set the tone up for that piece? So with the C, when you're talking to them, are you further, maybe you're further back, slowing the tonality. If you do those pieces, odds are when you ask that question, is there anything else you need to know to feel comfortable? And then just be quiet. Odds are they're going to tell you. But if we're rapid firing, that may be, so just slowing it down may give you that, what you're looking for, and them the opening to be able to say that, there is a question, there is that type of a thing.
Well, slow down and also maybe go one more question. So like in the example that I gave, my lender, I asked him and he said, oh yeah, I asked him, does this make sense? Do you understand? But I think what you're saying is he probably glossed over it. And then if the lender would have said, does that make sense to you, Justin? And he says, yep, it does. Because I lose most people at this point. So if it's not 100% clear, I'm more than happy to, to explain it a little bit more. At that point, I think when you go a little bit further and say, this is where I lose most people or whatever, then you give the HIGHC, I'm just thinking out loud, you give the HIGHC the permission to say, okay, if I ask this question, I'm not going to appear dumb.
Yeah, like I'm not the only person that's ever. The other thing is, even in the question, I would almost, and I'd love for you to, our HIGHC on the call to jump in here. I'm even going to suggest that the change in the question, does that make sense? Almost sets me up that I either have to say yes to like go along, or maybe appear wrong because I didn't catch it fast enough, right? Or something like, or I feel like there's a judgment there. So maybe even, and yet I absolutely love the follow-up to that of, this is what we do every day. And yet, I don't know, opening that up to maybe something besides, does that make sense? Maybe a different question, but definitely where that, a lot of times this is where people will say they need some clarity. Are there some questions? What are yours? How would you, or HIGHC on the call, how would that land best for you?
Is there another HIGHC on the call? I've talked a lot.
Yeah, no, it's all you, Jean, you and me.
So don't confuse HIGHCs with not being able to speak up. If you're rapid firing questions at me, I feel like you don't really care what I think anyway.
Yeah.
And you have lost me, because I'm going to go to someone who is going to ask me, do you have any questions? Not, do you get it?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I haven't done my homework if I don't get it.
Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's so funny how all those questions, because that's the other piece that we have to make sure, engineer, some of the smartest people in the world are HIGHCs. The difference between, so like if we think, and again, always know that in this, because we're talking, there is a, I am kind of talking extremes or examples, but a D, and if you're like, let's say you're a DI, behavioral style, if you don't like something as a D, you're probably, especially DI, because that I is driving you, you got to tell somebody, I don't like that, and what you did was wrong. And Jean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but with the C, and she said, I'm just going to go somewhere else. A C is like, well, you don't care about me. You didn't actually, you were not involved, you didn't allow me to be involved in this conversation anyways. I'm just going to go to the next person who will. So it's the same response, for lack of a better word, of But the C's just, they don't feel the need to confront you about it because you didn't care about me. I don't need to care. You know, is that accurate, Jean?
Sorry, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think and the reason I bring that up is I don't want you to hear fearful like they're timid. C's are not timid. It's the how they react to that is different than maybe a D or an I. Again, this is probably a bad example, but like if you're driving off of a cliff, even, you know, a D is going to feel like, I gotta well, that's not a good example. A D's like, I gotta tell you why you did that wrong. Or, you know, a C's like, you didn't ask me. Well, you know, like, and again, you didn't ask me. You didn't want my opinion. If you'd have asked me, I'd have told you. If you'd have done this, that, and that, you'd be fine. You didn't ask me, right? So just keeping those pieces when we look at how we respond is differently. Not a right or wrong, but just how we respond is differently. Okay. So how do we use this in a workplace situation? So let's say that we're interviewing, whether it is an agent or a somebody for an admin role. This is, you sent them a disc, because this is the other thing. We send the disc as kind of like the initial icebreaker. Like, let's say that we are going to go to coffee. Like, let's say that somebody's interested in, we'll start with the admin that works same for somebody that's a buyer's agent or showing partner, but they've got some interest in the position, whether it's because of a resume or whatnot. We've called, we've had a conversation. We like the way they sound on the phone. We go, hey, look, you know what? Let's have coffee and just explore this opportunity. What I'd love to do is send you an assessment. If you'll complete that before we get together, it'll just make sure that you don't kind of focus the conversation that we're having. They say, sure, you send them the disc, it comes back. That disc, right, y'all have got it. It's pretty thick. We're not looking to teach them a class on disc. So we're not gonna, like with the KPA, we validate it. So we go like line by line. We don't do that necessarily in this way of a disc, right? Now, let's say we hire them, we might come in and do that, but that's more of a teaching. So how do we do that in that coffee so that coffee that we're having with them doesn't become a 20-hour piece? So I'm going to go to that screen. Oh, so the current owner survey, remember I showed, this is me being I'm squirreling on you. That current owner survey, we would have this, you know, how would your best friend describe you? And then we have utilities, schools, their information, birthdays. Are you active on Facebook, social media, the expectation during the day? What's the best way to call, blah, 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 right? That was all part of our listing packet. Okay, this what I'm sharing with you guys can be found in that open source in your hub. Okay, so and if you're on here and you're not, well, I guess everybody on here, but if somebody's watching this later and you're not in my MAPS coaching schedule, let me know and I can email it to you. You can also find it on KW Connect in the education. This is how we actually use this. So now we've read their disc. We go to have coffee with them, lunch, whatever. Maybe we're doing it over Zoom. And you're literally, so you guys know how to do forward, right? So we're not going to go through that, but hey, you know, I've met them. How are you doing? You know, small talk. And then we're going to go, so let's talk about the results of your disc profile and what the disc measures. So let me share with you that about 75% of the people measured will have a, actually that should say 25%, will have a single dominant style. They'll lead with that. Only about 25% of the population, blah, blah. So you read that. It's like there's a script on the worksheet. So this worksheet, the blank one, is also in the open source. So you won't have, so this is what the worksheet looks like. So you would bring this worksheet, it's blank. And as you're walking through these pieces, right, you're at a table or you're on Zoom and you're flipped it around and you'll write and you'll see the verbiage that I'm going to use. And you're right. Okay, so this is fast aggressive. This is this. This is that. So that's the blank, or that's the filled out blank copy that you would use, right? But we would say, so you would, and it, like, I love this because it points this out to you. So on the worksheet, you would point out the DISC corners and quadrants. And you would just say, so this is a DISC. The goal of a high D is dominance, and I is influence. An S's goal is steadiness, and a C's goal is compliant. Then you'll explain the relationships. So when we look at the disc, we think about measuring speed and orientation. So you would write fast and aggressive along the horizontal line up here at the top between the I and D. And then you would, and then when we think about measuring speed, we think steady and cautious along the horizontal lines, right? So you're just writing that in as you're doing that. And then you go, now when we think the relationship between I's and S's, we think people relationship oriented, and you would just write that there. And then when we think about the relationships between D's and C's, and you write thinking task oriented along those lines. And then as you're telling them, you're going to be filling this in. And you would say, wherever they landed, right? So the key emotion of the candidate's dominant style, ask for feedback, and then fill in the key emotion. So the key emotion of a high I is optimism. If this person, right, you're going to talk just about what they were, and they go, is that true for you? And they go, oh yeah, everything's going to work out. You know, would you agree with that? The key emotional response for a high S is to hide their emotions. It might be tough for a high I, such as yourself, to relate to, because you're typically open and optimistic. The high I show what they're feeling, and when others hide their emotion, they may feel confused, frustrated, or even worried, right? And then, so do you see how you're giving them feedback from the disc, but you're not going over it line by line by line as if you were teaching class? And then you would fill in the motivated by blank for the candidate's dominant style, ask for feedback, and then fill in the motivators for the other styles, making comparisons back to that individual's dominant style. So a high I tends to be motivated by flattery and recognition. They don't mind the spotlight. What do you think about this? And interesting enough, sometimes they might go, oh, no, I don't have to have the spotlight. Oh, well, tell me a little bit, has there ever been a time? Well, I love talking, to groups. They may not have recognized that about themselves, right? And then you fill in the mantra for their dominant style, ask for feedback. High I tends to be the cheerleaders of the group. Their mantra typically is, you can do it, always encouraging others and working through people. They may be thrown off by a high C style, which is to push back until they can ensure compliance and correctness. The high I will think high C's are refusing a request, but they are really just seeking a level of quality and accuracy before taking action. So then you fill in the fears. The fear of a high I is rejection. Approval and acceptance is important to them, so they will work hard to avoid rejection. Do you relate to this? And they're probably going to, if you're talking to an I, they're probably going to give you a story and how that, fits. Fill in the box with the key words. So anyway, so you guys can, and then next, complete the speed and time circle at the center. So not only does the disc measure speed and orientation, it also measures temperature. We tend to think of high I's as running hot and fast, high D's as running cold and fast, high S's style are warm and slow, and high C's are slow and cool. And then you sum up by offering final thoughts about how this individual tends to interact with other behavioral styles and why. Try to explain in a storytelling fashion how this individual's world would look with all the behavioral styles interacting. So that's how you, and I know I went fast, but it's all right there for you. That's how you utilize this in a conversation at coffee versus making this going through it all. So what are you guys hearing? What are you seeing when we look at how to actually use that in a consultation?
Olivia?
I feel like sorry, go ahead.
No, go. You go. Go.
I feel like we'd have to really know what we're talking about. Like, I'm still learning this, and I'm trying to understand it myself. And so it's a little bit intimidating, although it sounds also kind of fun to do this with others.
Well, absolutely. And so this is what Hannah, this is the cool part about the script. So I want you, because this is something that you can all do homework for yourselves. Pretend like you're leading the consultant on yourself. So you're going to have, just like you would have the candidate's disc. So you're going to pull the disc and you're going to go, okay, well, I'm a high I. It'll say, what is your key emotion? What are you motivated? Your mantra, your fears, right? So you just literally fill that out. And when you do that, because that's the other interesting thing, even though you're just starting this, you know everything you need to know if you look at the disc and this how-to have this conversation. And the more you have it, the more you'll learn, because you'll start having the conversations and going, okay, they're an I, their key emotion is they're motivated by, right? And kind of continue through that. But yeah, love that, Hannah. Jean, you were going to say something?
Where do I get the link for, I have somebody I'm interviewing now. How do I send them a disc?
So because I have the hookup, normally to do a disc, oh, and I'm glad you asked that question. Abelson, I'm going to email it out to you. So Rashad, would you I'm sorry, not Rashad, Mon, will you make a note that everybody on today's call and last week's call, for me to send them the information to get certified in the disc?
Yes, Coach.
Thank you. Now, and some of you guys may not want to go that far with it. Some of you guys may, but I'll at least get you the information. So Abelson is the one that is my favorite disc. So back to your question, Jean. So since so I have the hookup, my brother's an OP in a market center, and they pay for the discs. And so that's how I was able to get all of you guys the disc, and there was at no charge, that type of thing, because they're paying for that. Until he cuts me off, have them do the same link to how you can take it. Send that to them. Just make sure you email me to say, hey, their name, and email it. Send that to me so that I'll know that came from you, and I'll do that and email it to you. What I'll also do is email you guys the information to Abelson, because even if you don't get certified, you can like order specific, like every time you have a new person or you want to do a disc, you can go there, and it's a pretty inexpensive cost, and get that disc taken, or have them take it. There used to be, I think Tony Robbins was one that used to have a free one. I will say that it was a good starting point, but I didn't find that it was as in depth as the disc. But being free helped probably. It is, but I don't know that he has that anymore. So I'll send you the website, but for now, or until I say differently, you can just send it to me and we'll send that to you.
Quick question. What does getting certified in the disc mean?
Just that you will, there's a lot that we have not covered. Like, we've done 2 hours on this, and we've really only talked about like if you lead with your D or you lead with your I. The majority of people lead with more than one, right? And so, and those have an impact. So for instance, if you look at somebody's graph, I know this is, let's say they're a DI-SC, where they land on that graph with their SC, even though it's not above the energy line, plays a part in how they're going to react to things. So what we've only done so far is just super, super, like the high level. There's a lot more that you can utilize this if you were, to go further with the study of it. Now, I will say that what we've done, especially if you go back and you read your disc and you look at this will help you leaps and bounds. You don't have to get certified, and yet some of us, like, this might be the kicker, and you're like, oh, I want to learn more. Then that might be on your growth plan. All right. Andi, were you going to ask something, or?
What I was going to say, am I muted? I can't tell.
No, you're good. We can hear you.
I'm good. I was going to say that what I'm listening and I'm absorbing and I hear, you know, oh, this friend is definitely an I, and this friend is definitely, and I am now realizing how I've adjusted myself to deal with them. Like when you say, you know, I want my answers fast, but I have a friend who's clearly, you know, she's taking her time. She's clearly an S. She's clearly thinking it through as she's answering me. And I'm like, okay, but I know with her, that's the way she is. And so if I can learn that with all my customers, and that's a friend, so I've known her a long time, but as soon as I can start, you know, recognizing that and working with my customers that way. So, you know, in my head, I'm going, hurry up and answer the question, but with her, I'm patient because I know this is her way.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, because the great part of it is it's all about creating that communication. So if you try to get her to speed up, you've shut down the communication, and that's not our intent, right? And the flip side of that, I'm sure in her, just, you know, I don't know your friend, but I bet she's still in her mind going, if Andy, I'm speeding up for Andy, right?
Yeah, probably. A lot of people, I think, do that for me.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the cool part. It's because it really is about how best to communicate. It's not about anybody being wrong, better. It's just how do we, when we understand the how people respond to things, it gives us a better opening to have better communication with them. Because from our point of view, without studying or learning different behavioral styles, we just think that everybody thinks like us and there's a disconnect there. So it definitely gives a good opening. And then you're absolutely right, Andy. Instead of having to know somebody for years to figure it out, as we, you know, take some of those tips from last week, putting that information, if we can identify it out up front, how much bigger could our business grow because we're opening up and being able to interact and communicate and influence more people.
And for me, I think that starts with listening. I want to talk, I want to jump in, and I have learned just to hold on and try to listen first to what their questions are and what their concerns are, because I'm like always teaching. This is what you have to do.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you said, and that is a I behavioral style. That's a DI, like very much like I think I know I've interrupted at least somebody on this call today, right? Because we get excited. And yet, I mean, it's rude, but it's also like, we're not trying to be rude. We're just excited, or we're this or that. And so taking that pause and slowing down, that's a huge piece so that we are, you know, creating that communication at a higher level. So love it. All right. So, again, this consultation instruction, that is in open source, so that you can grab that. And any other questions or ahas or anything before we wrap up?
Will this recording be in open source, or do we go somewhere else for that?
Yeah, it's if you go to, it is going to be in your hub, but there'll be a link that says YouTube videos.
Okay.
And you'll be able to access it there. Now, mine will email it out tomorrow or by tomorrow to everybody. And then we know things get lost in the email, so we also put a link in that YouTube link from your hub.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. All right. That's our time. You guys have an amazing week. If we haven't had our individual coaching call yet this week, we'll be doing that. And then, yeah. So see you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bye.